This is the Mormon Mixed Faith Marriage podcast with certified life coach Brooke Booth, episode number 90. So I have a guest on my podcast today. Her name is Reed Dean. Said that right? Did I? Correct me. I didn't write down your last name. I'm like, did I remember right? But I did. I know her by her first name because I have a son named Reed. So it's a very easy name for me to remember. So Reed is a colleague of mine. She's also a life coach, and she's somebody I would consider to be a really good friend. She's coached me on so many things. Like she kind of knows a lot of how my brain works and how things work in my head. But the reason I wanted her to be on this podcast is because as she has coached me over the years, I've really seen an insight into her wisdom and her perceptiveness. And I'm like, she needs to be on here and share some of that with you all. So Reed was also raised LDS, and she's had a very rich relationship experience. So what I want to really talk to her about and unpack with her a little bit is relationships in faith, because they can have an interesting intersection. There can be a really interesting dynamic, how they feed into or play off of or are conflict with each other. And as I was thinking about this, Reed, like I know I'm a relationship coach. I'm familiar with that. And I tend to have other relationship coaches on and talk to them. But I realized I didn't know your niche. Like you coach me all the time on relationships and on money and on my house and on all sorts of things. But I didn't know what your niche is. Why don't you tell me a little bit about the work you do with your own clients?
Yeah. Well, firstly, thank you so much for having me on. I'm beyond excited to talk to you today. Every time we do talk, I feel like I come back to my own life with a deeper understanding of what it even means to be a coach, because you've taught me so much.
Thank you.
But back to my niche, I do general life coaching with a specialty in habit coaching.
Okay.
So with the general life coaching, that encompasses a lot of relationship stuff.
Yeah.
Obviously, relationship with self as well as relationships with every other person in your life.
Yeah.
But yeah, the specialization is habits, which is super fun, and I'm really passionate about.
That is interesting. Now that I know that, I'm gonna come to our next call with some more stuff, but I get you on the general stuff because I'm throwing all sorts of stuff your way. So Reed and I, we coach each other on and off. And we were in the same certification cohort, like in that same little group. So we've been coaching each other for a couple of years now. It's really interesting to see our relationship in the lens of like coach client. It's really fascinating, isn't it?
Yeah, I actually have to share a quick story about meeting each other. Now that you're bringing it up, so that very first call that we got on in school with all our fellow classmates, we all went around the room and introduced ourselves, and we were all from completely different walks of life, different parts of the world even. And genuine, I've never told you this before. Out of every person in that group, I thought you were the weirdest person. I left the call and I was like, everyone's great, but I am not sure about this broke girl. Like, and I don't know if it was just because you were really quiet, but I do remember you getting on the call and saying, I'm an attorney, but I'm a coach. Like you already had a coaching practice.
I did.
I thought, who is this person? Who does she think she is, showing up to this certification, already a coach? And I was so intimidated by you now in hindsight, looking back. And we've formed maybe the best friendship for me out of everyone in the group now. And I'll die laughing about that.
It totally cracks me up because I am a little weird. Like I really am. I totally own that about myself.
Well, and what I love is I had no idea how much we had in common. So the fact that I point you out is just that much more funny to me. I'm like, I saw myself in you. That's exactly why I was like, I don't know about her.
It's so true. I pick out people that I totally relate to that story. Not that I thought you were weird, because that's not my memory at all. I thought
You're much nicer than me.
No, there's the beautiful blonde. That's what I appreciate that story. That was fantastic because Well, we could talk about that later, but I remember that call. I was apprehensive, but excited. So I can understand why I'd probably come off a little weird.
Well, and just so bold to show up and be like, I'm already a coach. Because I was coming in like so nervous and imposter syndrome, right? All of it.
I thought more people would be coaches going into it, to be honest.
Mhm.
Yeah, but that's clearly another way my brain works.
Yeah.
Okay, let's talk about relationships and faith, because I know you have so much experience in this area. And it's such, I can't talk about it enough, obviously. I mean, this is what I do most days. You probably don't remember this, but when I say this question, maybe it jogged your memory. But I remember we had a conversation once, like in the course of whatever our coaching or our conversations or whatever. And you told me that, so you were raised LDS, you had a faith transition, and you can clarify the details, but if I recall, you were like 18, 19-ish, 17, somewhere in there. And tell us the details. But I remember you told me, like, we were talking about language, and you said you never had like a faith crisis or a faith in God crisis, but you had a faith in church crisis. And I was really fascinated by this, by like your take on it. And also, like, I think it shined a window into like how you experienced your faith transition. But tell me a little bit of like, tell me more about that.
Yeah. So it's funny because when you asked me to be on the podcast, I was immediately so excited and nervous. And then when I saw the questions, I was like, oh man, okay. I have never publicly spoken about leaving the LDS church or my current beliefs, partly because I felt so defensive
Mm.
and just numerous negative emotion when I heard any opposing conversation about the church while I was in it. And I currently have so many friends and family who actively believe, who I love and respect dearly. And so I just want to kind of preface by saying that I deeply support all active believing members in their choice to believe. And while I no longer do believe in the doctrine, I think I still do share a lot of beliefs about life and faith. And I hope some people will still be open to hearing what I have to say, as I'll continue to be open to their beliefs as well.
And
And
I'll interject because like that's what this podcast is all about, right? Mixed faith marriages, like people who are not in the church and people who are in the church, and how to like love, support, like be with each other, hold space for each other, listen to each other. I love how you're framing this. Go ahead.
mhm,
Such a perfect way you've said that.
yeah, and even the identity is anti-Mormon.
Yeah.
Right? It's so aggressive, kind of. And I fully understand why some people adopt that identity and support their, choice to do that. It's never felt right for me. And I still don't have a specific title that I feel I'm comfortable with labeling myself as necessarily. Um, but back to your question about the faith crisis and how I said that I didn't have a faith in God crisis necessarily. It was a faith in the church crisis. And I specifically phrase it that way because I remember while in the church often hearing that phrase, faith crisis, kind of thrown around. And I always assumed when it was spoken about that the person in question or whoever was claiming to have a faith crisis, that they no longer believed in God or Jesus, which therefore encompassed the church and everything within it. And so because that wasn't my experience, I realized, okay, it's much more a faith in the church crisis for me. And the reason being is that I never stopped believing in a higher power. And by that, I mean, um, kind of an all encompassing, um, intangible part of the universe that connects all of us that I don't fully understand.
Mhm.
And I believe that all religion, when they are talking about a God, are generally speaking about the same thing. And I still identify as a very spiritual person. And so that was never really in question for me,
Right.
although I don't believe in maybe the Father in heaven figure that the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints believes and teaches about in their doctrine specifically.
Mhm.
I think many parts of that being are still a part of what I believe
Mhm.
connects us. And the faith in the church crisis, it that did kind of start around high school, 17, 18 years old. And it especially came kind of crumbling down by the time I was 21. So I would say it was a good 5-year period.
Yeah. I'm so fascinated to hear other people's stories. 'Cause, like 17, 18, I was like 36. It's like a totally different experience to me. When I was 17, 18, yeah, I was in high school and then I went to BYU and then I went on my mission. I was like having a very different like faith journey at that point. And
Mhm.
I'm endlessly fascinated, like, because I think it takes, and we'll talk about this later, but I think it takes a great deal of courage, frankly, to do it at that age that you were at. Um, what was that for you at that age? If you don't mind me asking, if you do, we can just move on.
Yeah. Well, I'd also like to share that for me, the church wasn't an option. It and by that, I mean it was such an intrinsic part of who I was.
Sure.
And and I don't say that with any resentment, malice, or any negative emotion really whatsoever. It just was.
Mhm.
And it in a lot of ways it was a beautiful of being raised.
Agreed. Mhm.
That's why I believe it'll always be a part of me, and it's not and I can't fully reject all of it because that would be rejecting a part of who I am. And
Yeah. So I can still relate to that. Keep going.
yeah, and I mean, I think as I maybe went into the youth program or started to develop more of a sense of self, um, that's when I took on some traits that are harder for me to accept as an adult that I look back on, even like with some shame or guilt or regret for having been that person. Which it's interesting. That's something I walk with because I was still a child, right?
Yeah.
But those teenage years, I had a lot of ego, self righteousness, judgment for others, pride, and I do have grace for that version of me, but that's kind of where I started to see some negative threads maybe in the teachings of the church and how I internalized them and
Yeah.
represented myself through them. And it was particularly difficult to start to have this faith in the church crisis as a teenager because I cared so deeply for it and for the community and for that part of myself and all of the relationships within it, including the relationship with my immediate family. My parents have just recently left the church. So for years, they were still active members while I wasn't. So I felt like I completely lacked any support whatsoever in even having a crisis as well.
Mhm. Mhm. Okay, that ties into the relationship, like how your faith journey and your relationships sort of interwove or didn't.
Mhm,
How were your relationships impacted by, or let me say it a different way. Like how did your faith journey impact your relationships?
mhm. Um, yeah, so that's a really heavy question.
Isn't
That would,
it?
that would probably take days to unpack.
You give us the highlights. You don't have to give us
I'm
something.
trying to figure out. I mean, it just kind of goes back to how it just my beliefs are such an intrinsic part of who I am. I think all of us can
Mhm,
relate to that. That every relationship that I've been in has been greatly impacted by my beliefs at the time.
mhm.
And each relationship has been almost fundamentally different because of that.
Oh, really?
Yes, absolutely. And I was just talking to my parents the other day about this actually, and about how I think oftentimes being raised in the church almost teaches us to accept, I don't want to use the word abuse, but it almost teaches us to accept environments and accept relationships that we might otherwise not,
Okay, I can see that.
either in the name of um, Christianity, right? Christ like love, compassion. In my first relationship, I found myself often in the savior complex, right? In believing, okay, even though I'm being hurt by this person, it's okay because they say and do these things, and because they believe and love God, that we're all sinners, right?
Yeah.
They can be forgiven, and it's my job to forgive, and it's my job to support and to love. So I accepted a lot. I really lacked boundaries in that relationship.
Mhm.
And I attribute some of that to the teachings in the church that told me to be a loving, supportive spouse, you have to do X, Y, and Z. And so I did that. And then when it didn't pan out or ever change or get better, that,
Mhm.
that really kind of supported the faith crisis too.
That is so interesting to me because, like I said, I had my faith transition crisis at a very different like phase of life,
Mhm.
but I had a very similar experience. Like when I looked back, um, I realized so like my faith journey has impacted my relationship like all along the way. Like a lot of times people who have it a little bit later, they're like, and then we had the faith transition and then the marriage like had all this issues. And I realized that actually my faith journey the whole time was impacting my relationships, just like you're saying here. And I look back at the early part of my relationship when we were both very, very, very active believing, which I'm not saying is a bad thing, but this is how I see it impacting my relationship is I was so focused on like obedience and doing the things right and being a really good Mormon that I assumed by doing those things the marriage would be taken care of. Like doing those things was also taking care of my marriage. Doing those things was also nurturing my marriage. It wasn't, right? Like, my focus was on like having a great relationship came secondary to my faith, my obedience, my membership. So if I would spend my time, doing a family home needing lesson on baptism or temples or missionary work or something, I wasn't like I wasn't investing a lot of time and effort like learning relationship skills or understanding like relationships. It was oh, it'll be all okay because I'm doing these things. And it was very much a secondary, like, or tertiary even, or even below that, like, oh, it'll be fine. If I'm doing these things, it'll be fine. And I was really surprised to learn it wasn't. Like, I was really surprised to learn, like, doing all those other wonderful things, serving and teaching kids and all of that wasn't actually nurturing my marriage, wasn't actually helping me develop relationship skills.
Mhm.
It's kind of a surprise. Like now I'm like, well, that makes sense. But at the time I was very surprised.
Mhm. Yeah, I've heard that before from I wonder if that is more common of couples who are in the church together for years, decades.
Yeah.
I've heard those exact words almost of I didn't even think about our relationship really, because we did everything right. We were doing everything we were supposed to. So why?
Yeah.
And in my marriage, it was a little different. It was that we felt like we were doing everything wrong and that we had done everything wrong, so that we both needed such saving. And there was so much shame, and there were so many layers to the shame that we were constantly just trying to like save ourselves,
Mhm.
and therefore had no time to devote actually to the relationship. It was always our relationship to God with each other, which was really complex. But kind of to wrap up the whole faith in the church crisis talk, um, I'd say kind of the pinnacle of it all was when I fully realized and recognized that my experience within the church was not safe. And that sentence alone really is the only thing I think that needs to be said when I've ever been questioned or
Right.
asked. And it's hard for some people to hear. It's also very hard for some people to understand because it's so contradictory to their
Their
beliefs
experience. Yeah. Yeah.
and their experience, right?
Mhm.
And I won't say, or I guess I won't claim that it was never safe, because I did feel safety in it for a long time. But it definitely got to a point where it was no longer safe, as well as my marriage. So, kind of together, a lot was brought to light for me. And more than anything, it was just the realization that so many facets of my autonomy were stripped from me within the church. And just to throw out a small example, that was kind of a tipping point for me when I was contemplating my future within the church or not. It was really important in that marriage because we hadn't been sealed in the temple and we wanted to get there.
Sure.
And while learning in temple prep and um, together, when we were as close as we'd ever been to getting there, I learned that if we had been sealed and I had died, that my spouse would be able to go on and marry another woman,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and not only marry, but be sealed to another woman for eternity. But if the reverse happened and he died, I would not be able to be sealed to a different man,
Right. And
another husband.
I'll just add a plug here. Carolyn Pearson has a book called Ghosts of Eternal Polygamy, where she really unpacks this and
Mhm.
some of the repercussions and some of the effects and impacts it has on people's lives and marriages and relationships. Fascinating read. Fascinating. Okay, so that's what you were experiencing. And yeah, that's a heavy lift for anybody.
Yeah, and on top of that, at one point, um, my husband at the time had said, "I don't know if I want to be with you forever." This was kind of toward the end of everything, but while we were still actively trying to get to the temple,
Mhm.
and then learning that information that he could go on to be like sealed to other people, but I wouldn't be able to. I was at a crossroads. It
Sure.
was like, and but more than anything, it's truly just that principle of consent. And where was my consent, right, if I died?
Yeah. This story, and what you're talking about here in my own experience, it's really highlighting to me like how our faith journeys and our belief systems, like there's a real impact and effect it has on our relationships. Like they are impacting and playing into each other and really interwoven. And I think when we think they aren't, and we think they're completely separate, I think we're missing a lot of really valuable information.
I agree.
That's so interesting. Okay, let's talk a little bit about relationships. Just relationships, because I wanted to pick your brain a little bit about, like, the question I asked you is like, what do you think are pillars of a good relationship? And I went back and I read that and I'm like, that's a big question. Like you could write like a doctoral dissertation on this.
Right.
And on and on and on. But I'm like, that's okay. I want to hear what Reed says. I know she has, like, I know she really thinks about these things and that she's going to have some really good ideas. So I want to hear from you. And I came up with one. And I want to just preface, like, the ideas here, we're just throwing out ideas. We're not saying that, like, you have to have these pillars to have a good relationship, but these are just things that we've sort of thought about. So what did you come up with?
Okay. Yeah, once I heard this question, I was like, all right.
I know, me too. I'm like, I asked that. Okay.
Yeah, I was like, love it, but also, okay, generalizations. Let's make some generalizations about relationship skills and pillars of a good relationship. And I would kind of like to hear yours first, just to see.
I'd love to go first. Like I said, I love talking about this kind of stuff. So as
Yeah.
I was thinking about it, I'm like, okay, there's probably any number ones, and I think probably a lot of them are really tailored to individuals. But the one I picked out, if I could just pick one, this is the one I would pick out. And I generally called it health. But what I mean when I say health is I'm talking like mental and emotional health. I'm talking about an individual's willingness to engage in self-development and taking responsibility for their patterns and really being able to, like, engage with themselves in the relationship.
Yeah.
If that makes sense, like where they're seeing two people having a relationship. A lot of times when there's not this happening, like I'll sort of describe what it isn't to help describe what it is. So when this isn't happening, there's a lot of blame and the other person needs to change. And if they would just be different, we wouldn't have these problems or we'd have a great relationship.
Mhm.
When I'm talking about like this vague word of health, I'm talking about like, okay, what's like, where am I at mentally? Where am I at emotionally? Where am I playing into the dynamic here? Like, where am I, what can I do? What can I control to help improve, to fix this? What's my own personal development? What's my responsibility here? I'll give you an example. So my husband and I have been we're always working through stuff, but lately we're working through extra special stuff. And I see us both doing this. I see us both like digging deep, like taking care of ourselves mentally and emotionally. I see us both taking responsibility for how we're showing up in the relationship. So we'll have a conversation, we'll recognize a pattern, and then I'll be like, okay, I can see I can work on this, this, and this, like to clean up my side of the street. And he's over there and he's like, yeah. And I can see I can do this, this, and this to clean up my side of the street. To me, this is like amazing. Like where we're both like knowing our own individual work that we're doing, when we then come together having done that work, it's fantastic. I'm not saying it isn't work, but it's like something I haven't really experienced before in my relationship, and I'm kind of loving it. So that's my pillar. Well, a lot said there, but my pillar is basically like taking care of your own mental and emotional health, like doing your own self-development, looking at yourself, not to blame yourself, not to beat yourself up, not to judge yourself, but to understand what's going on here and how it's playing into the relationship. Okay, that's mine. Kind of vague, but I think it's super important.
Yeah. Okay. No, I love that. I love how similarly we think. So mine are kind of just a breakdown of that review. I love that. But also how fascinating too, because you've now been married, is it 20 or 21 years?
21 in November. So we're at the 20-year mark.
Yeah. So you've been married for 20 years and you're like, this is new. This is a part of our relationship. That's incredible.
Yeah,
really.
I know.
You're like, you're telling me.
Yeah, I know what it's like not doing that for 20 years, so I'm enjoying it.
Yeah. Yeah, so I've broken it down. I tried to be kind of general too, just because we could probably think of 20 if we tried to come up with it.
We really could.
But the first was awareness of self, which is kind of exactly what you're saying,
Mhm.
and autonomy,
Yeah.
which those are different, but they really kind of work together because with awareness of self, I think often comes awareness of autonomy and either how we've been fostering that or not.
Yeah.
The next thing was trust. First with yourself and
Tell me
then
about
your
this.
partner.
I've been like developing some ideas around trust, and I want to hear what you think about that.
Yeah, so overarchingly, the most important part of trust is emotional regulation because if you aren't regulating your own emotions,
Do you mean like trusting yourself to do
yes,
your
yourself and your partner. So
Okay.
I think emotional regulation together and solo, super important.
Agreed.
But self comes first because if you can't regulate your emotions yourself, then together it's not going to work either. And
Mhm.
also you won't feel safe with your partner if you don't feel safe with yourself.
Yeah.
And that is really kind of a thread through every part of your life. It's not the safety with self you bring everywhere.
I love what you're saying here. I was talking to another coach recently about this, and we were realizing like that this trust element in a relationship is what you're saying here. It really starts like with me. Like, can I trust myself to like process my emotions, to like have the awareness and process my emotions and acknowledge what I'm feeling and work through it and take care of myself, and then show up into the relationship like having that groundwork laid.
Hmm.
And oftentimes when we talk about trust, we're like, well, I need to trust them to, I don't know, do whatever you think they should be doing.
Right.
And I was like, that's like different because that's like maybe boundaries
Hmm.
or communication, but really trust, I just seem to always be coming back to me. I'm like, can I trust myself to set boundaries? Can I trust myself to communicate more clearly? Can I trust myself to do my own emotional work
Hmm.
so that I can show up in this relationship? It's fascinating to me because for so long I saw trust as like something my husband had to give me instead of it's something I gave and provided for myself. And so then it tied into like safety, like he had to give me safety instead of me creating safety for myself and showing up in this relationship with good judgment. I'm
Hmm.
not saying like show up, showing your soft underbelly if that's not safe, but like really prioritizing myself and my own safety so that I didn't show up emotionally triggered or emotionally dysregulated or whatever.
Hmm.
That's such an interesting point you're making.
Yeah, there's a quote, and I'm not going to remember the specifics of it whatsoever, but it's kind of along the lines of how often we think, like you're saying, that we have to trust our partner is not going to betray us in some way, right? When really we need to be able to trust that we can handle whatever our partner does or doesn't do.
Right. Yeah, you've said it perfectly.
And betrayal, this is something I teach my clients, betrayal is going to happen.
Yes, isn't it?
It is inevitable. It's not an if, but when.
Yeah.
And by betrayal, I don't necessarily mean infidelity, financial betrayal, maybe these big things that initially come to mind. No, those don't always happen. But maybe it's just telling a joke at your expense or making plans without asking you first, right? If you would like to engage in those plans or not. Your reaction and your feelings of feeling betrayed, that's going to come up.
Mm-hmm.
So, can you be with yourself? Can you process those emotions or not?
Yeah. I love it. It's so important. Like I was thinking about in a mixed faith marriage, a common way trust and betrayal comes up is like, you left the church, you broke your covenants, you've betrayed. And then there's the other one of like, well, you weren't there for me when I needed you the most, when I was in the depths of my faith transition. And yeah, there it is, right? There it is. And is that really a lack of trust, or is that more processing grief and pain and sorrow and disappointment and hurt?
Mhm.
And is that more like, taking care of yourself to work through, your emotions and the things that need to be worked through so that you can then show up in the relationship and, talk about next steps and talk about how like the practical impacts this is going to have in the family and things.
Yeah, and if we shine the light on ourselves completely and leave our partner out of it, can we trust that we will show up the way that we want to? There's so much fear around that because the answer is no. Half the time you're not going to show up the way you want to, which then leads to needing to process a lot of emotion.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes. Really good point. Okay. Do you have any other pillars?
The next one was respect, kind of slash humanization. And this one I think is so fun to talk with coaches about because it's like we actively recognize our partner's reality is valid, worthy, true. We'll talk about that. And I think sometimes we use the manual and the teachings of the manual in a way that kind of hinders us at times because it is putting all of the focus really kind of on the other person and their actions and all of the things we've, thought about them and less about us and how we actually view them.
Right.
I don't know if that is making sense or if you're following, but so often with the manual, we're still using it as like a self coaching tool rather than recognizing where we need to humanize and how we've actually dehumanized our partner with this manual. It's not this innocuous little, oh yeah, I wish they would be different. It's like, no, you legitimately view them as less than you and less valid to the nth degree, like
So
extreme.
okay, I love what you're saying here. So just as a recap, the manual is like the instruction manual we have for our spouses. You should fill in the blank or you shouldn't fill in the blank. And then when they don't do those things, what you're saying, and I think you're spot on, is we use that as an excuse to dehumanize them.
Yeah, and I specifically use that word dehumanize because it is triggering for people, and most would claim they've never gone there. They would never do that or think in that way. But per the manual, you want this person to not be who they are, to act differently, whether it's act better or not
But
be who they.
what you're saying, I've totally seen myself do this. When my husband doesn't follow my manual, like I'm immediately like, what is he thinking? Right? How could he possibly see it a different way? Which is completely form. Like it is a way of dehumanizing. Like
Right.
that's ridiculous that you would see it any other way.
And it is completely lacking respect,
Yes, it really, really is.
which
What I
we
see with the
feel.
manual work is like once that dehumanizing steps in, the respect steps out, um, disconnection is often like there's a lack of love, there's a lack of compassion, and there's a lot of disconnection.
Mhm.
The dehumanizing stuff is fascinating. I'm going to have to think about some more of that because when we start to dehumanize others, that's when like the bad behavior starts showing up. That's when like the really ugly stuff starts to show up because they're not humans, so they're not, worthy of whatever it is, respect, compassion, understanding,
Yeah,
goodness.
and I'd say many of us with a religious background, right? We're taught from such a young age that there are good people and bad people. There's a right way and a wrong way,
Mhm.
which kind of leads to this binary thinking and makes it very easy to reject everything foreign to us, everything our partner does that we don't love.
And then I can see when we get into that kind of frame of mind, we spin. The way it can be so easy to spin there and stay there for weeks, months, years. Yeah, that's interesting insight. Okay, what else have you got?
So the last one I had was interdependence, which is kind of the practice you were just describing with your husband, right? It's kind of a more day-to-day tactical pillar, I guess. It's how do you actively interact with each other? How often are you thinking of each other and the little things? How considerate are you? How dependent are you able to be on each other? And that goes back to the trust, awareness, respect.
We need to talk about this one some more, because this is one I personally struggle with, like in my own relationship. So I want to set this up for you and let's talk about it. Let's brainstorm a little bit. So, and I see this with clients too, especially people who've been married decades.
Mhm.
So you see this whether like maybe one of the spouses has a more demanding career or demanding church callings. So that means it happens a lot. So how I'll see this set up is, so let's say husband's away at bishopric meetings and youth conferences and youth meetings and la 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 la. And then he also has maybe a demanding career on top of that. So he's not around a lot. So the wife or the partner who doesn't have as many, outside the home demands, I'm not saying they don't have a lot of in the home demands, but outside the home demands on them, sometimes they start to come up with like coping techniques to deal with the disappointment and the lack of support and having to like deal with all the home stuff as a solo parent.
Mhm.
They come up with the coping mechanisms, and I've done this, where like, I don't need you, it's okay if you leave, like I've got this. And so they think less about their partner, they connect less with their partner, just in an effort to like cope with the overwhelming demands
Mhm.
of, this single married parent, as I sometimes call it.
Mhm.
So let's talk about that. Like, because what you're describing, I think, is super important. But
Yeah.
I see myself like dropping it a lot because I'm then trying to cope with.
Right. Well, and the scenario you just described is a spouse who's interdependent with the church,
Yeah.
right?
Tell us about that, because I think you're making a really good point.
What do you do when your spouse, and maybe this is getting into like codependency even, right?
Which I talk about all the time in my coaching, so we can go there.
Yeah. But if you can't be interdependent together as well, that's a huge divide.
Mhm.
And what do you do? What
Yeah.
advice would you give? Right? I think that's more a question for you, for sure. What advice do you give to the spouse whose spouse is very clearly interdependent?
Is this something I deal with
And
clients?
really anything outside of it, because it could be work too, right? It could be really anything
Oftentimes,
outside of.
yeah, oftentimes it's both.
Mhm.
So it's really interesting because I do believe what you're saying is like that, like the connection, the reaching out, the thinking of I think that's really important. But then sometimes this like coping, protect yourself can be at odds with this wanting to be interdependent. So let's talk about how I would maybe approach it with a client. I'd love to hear from you because I love collaborating and talking through things.
Yeah.
So when a client presents this way to me, um, sometimes I like to just take a minute and understand like historically how this relationship worked, because a lot of times it is a historic thing where like it's years of maybe being disappointed that he's not coming home in time for dinner, or disappointed that he's not helping put the kids to bed. And it's not always the he, sometimes it's the she, but
Also, while also supporting that, right? I think there's so often you're torn because you're like, I believe in all this too. You're the bishop, you have to be there. You have to go.
yeah, like, and so there's an internal dissonance there, because, and this was definitely my lived experience for years. I want you to go, I want you to serve, I want you to help, and this is really hard to be home and take care of these kids and make dinner and clean up from dinner night after night after night after night. So one of the first things I like to do with clients is when they find themselves here is to do some like just plain vanilla emotional processing. Like, let's look at that disappointment that's causing, like, sort of triggering the coping mechanism.
Right.
That's
So you're saying start with awareness, right?
right.
Like the awareness and your autonomy
Uh-huh.
outside of it.
Like,
Yeah.
let's focus on what you can control, like what you have autonomy over, not what you can't control. And let's like I like to always sort of like, okay, let's back it up and let's see, because a lot of times we're looking at sort of the symptom, and let's back it up and see the cause. So if we have disappointment that's going unchecked or unprocessed, and then that's leading to resentment, or that's leading to this, and this. Okay, let's go back and let's let's first look at that disappointment. Let's understand it. Let's validate it. Let's process it. Let's make space for it.
Mhm.
That's where I like to start. And a lot of times that can be really challenging work because it can be decades old, the disappointment.
Mhm.
But really acknowledging it and taking some time to let that be just what it is. And I like how you're tying it into the pillars. It is awareness. And then you've got some emotional processing mixed into that. And then sometimes once they've like looked at the disappointment and like own that and understand their patterns of when they feel disappointed, then they reach for these coping mechanisms of maybe withdrawing or, backing out of that interdependence sort of things that you highlighted. Sometimes just at that point, like that's all that needs to be done. Then they're like, oh, well, I don't need these coping mechanisms anymore. I can just reach out to my spouse, or I can do these things. Sometimes the coping mechanisms have become almost like habitual
Mhm.
because, they're just, oh, he's late, and we just slip into the coping mechanisms. When I see that, like if they just don't sort of resolve themselves, sometimes it's just a little bit more understanding why the coping mechanisms, like this is where I might do thought work. Like, why this coping mechanism, like what's the thought and the feeling causing you to show up in this particular coping mechanism. And sometimes we need to sort of wiggle it loose with just some like good old-fashioned thought work around the coping mechanism.
Right.
Some
Yeah. Yeah. I think a lot of what you're talking about is that awareness and then self-coaching, right? And then moving into the trust and emotion processing. How can you be safe with yourself here? We haven't really talked about safety much, but in our coaching with each other, we talk about it all the time and how so often the issue is a lack of feeling safe in some capacity, and why. So here, when you feel like you're doing everything on your own, do you not feel safe?
Yeah.
Why? What element of that?
Mhm.
And it's hard sometimes for people to even identify where it is, because in their mind, they're like, I have everything I need or could want.
Yeah.
I physically am as safe as I've ever been. So why don't I feel emotionally safe here? And that is all about the self-trust and then the trust in your partner too.
I want to say something here because like when you said interdependence and you listed those like lovely things to do, um, if we try to just jump in and start doing those things without looking at like the cause of why we're not doing it right now, that's where it can burn out really quick. Like that's where you can start doing it, maybe do it for like 3 days and then lose steam, lose motivation. It just doesn't stick. And that's why I love to like just go a little bit like what's causing you to not do these things in the first place and clean that up. And then a lot of times those interdependence things, like the reaching out, thinking of, connecting, I think they happen almost naturally. Not always, but with a lot more ease and a lot more like effortlessness once that, whether it's the lack of safety or the disappointment or and then the coping mechanisms, once those have been addressed, I
Mhm.
find that like a lot of couples have the skills and they know how to be interdependent. They just had a few obstacles blocking the way.
Mhm.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, let's wrap up because I know we've got a time thing. What I want to hear is you're obviously very smart. You're obviously a very good coach. People want to work with you. Where can they find you?
Well, thank you for that. I mainly work off of referrals. So for anyone that does reach out, please let me know where you found me here. But just on Instagram at Reed Dean Coaching. So just my full name, coaching. That's the best place. And what was I gonna say? Felt like there was one more thing. Go ahead though.
I'll say this. I follow you on Instagram and I love it. So I would recommend anybody follow her on Instagram. She puts interesting.
Oh, I was gonna say you'll mostly see habit coaching stuff.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I am a general life coach, so I absolutely love coaching on any and everything, especially relationships.
And I'll say this, if you have if you're just like, wait, where is she? Just reach out to me. I'll send you her information. That's how referrals work. Happy to do it.
Exactly. There you go.
It's super easy. There's an easy solution here. Okay, I'll put it in the show notes too. I don't always do that, but I'm going to do it this time because I'm going to get better and smarter. Okay, this was a really fascinating relationship. I mean, we do have a fascinating relationship, but this was a fascinating conversation. One thing I'm realizing as I'm just like sort of reflecting on this is like I always knew faith and religion and relationships were like, had their own sort of special relationship, but I'm seeing that more and more now. And that's something I think I'll speak more about like in more specific ways because it's so fascinating to me.
It's completely interwoven.
Mhm.
I could talk for days about how it's individually impacted each of my relationships for me.
Yeah, when you said that, it really got me thinking because like I think you're spot on. And it's impacted my relationship at every phase, pre-faith transition, during the faith transition, post-faith transition. It has completely impacted that. And I realized for a while, I was a little bit distracted by the faith transition and I was sort of putting all of the like blame there. Not that there's blame, like I don't want to use blame, but all of the like causation there. But I realized it's not just the faith transition. Like there was like interesting faith informed things all along impacting the relationship for good or not so good the whole time. And I want to be fair, like there's a lot of really great things I've learned from my faith that have really helped my relationship. And there are some other things that just maybe had me take my eyes off the ball a little bit. It's so interesting.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you for your brilliance and your time.
Thank you.
I'm gonna be in touch.
Bye.